Peter, for inviting me. And the theme of this lecture is a Heidegger-Latour fusion. And I think this might be the only room in the world in which that could plausibly be undertaken right now. Most of the people in the world who believe this is a possible project are sitting here. That it does not include Bruno Latour himself, who is no fan of Heidegger. I'm slowly pushing him and trying to influence him in that direction, but he's resisting every step of the way. Initially, the connection for me was simply that I liked them both. And I had to puzzle over this a long time, too, until finally the connection became clear. I've been working on Heidegger intensively ever since I was about 19 years old, and only became familiar with Latour about 10 years after that. And immediately, I had the same positive reaction to Latour's work that I had to Heidegger's, even though in tone and to some extent in substance it's completely different. And that was a long road to try to translate them into each other. And I hope that I've managed to do that in my manuscript, which I would be happy to hear Bruno Latour's reaction to in February. He has not seen it yet, so if you want to see it, you can contact me. You can see it before Latour himself does. I wanted to be the last person to see it before we have the workshop, so that I've got more people on my side, or 70 or 80 readers behind me, backing me up before he even sees it. Well, it's also no accident that we would be discussing this, not in a philosophy department, but in some other department, because we have Heidegger, who's, I would say, the most recognized 20th century philosopher in many circles now. There might be some dispute about that, but I think you could claim he's the one really universal figure along the traditional analytic continental dividing line. Whereas Bruno Latour is not really taken seriously as a philosopher by many people at all. This summer in Saint-Denis in Normandy, we had the week-long colloquium on Latour's thoughts. And I believe every philosopher in the world, every philosopher we know of in the world who takes Latour seriously as a philosopher was present, and there were about 6 of us. And so there's a long road ahead there, too, to get people to take Latour seriously as a philosopher. I think linking Heidegger with Latour is the way to do it, since Heidegger is already taken so seriously by so many different camps in philosophy. Now, the usual reading of Heidegger, as I see it, is completely mistaken. He's usually read as a pragmatist. And his tool analysis is taken as a kind of pragmatism. There's a practical reason before there's theoretical awareness. I'm going to talk a little today about why I think that's a false reading. Try to look at what I think is a deeper way to appropriate approach Heidegger, and show how that links to Latour, in my view. Okay, so let's take a look at Heidegger. Nice photo that Peter found on the web. Now, I have a strength and 2 weaknesses here. This is not typically what will be seen as Heidegger's strength, so I'll have to explain this a bit later. The way I see it, what you did in Heidegger with the tool analysis, is that things are not reducible to any of their relations, in any sense. It's a kind of return to a strange version of the old-fashioned substance theory, but in a form that can withstand all the postmodern critiques of substance. Weaknesses: preserves dominance of human beings over all entities. No matter how he tries to escape it, Dasein always ends up being at the center of things for Heidegger. Human Dasein, human existence. And so, in my view, he remains trapped within the Kantian tradition of philosophy to some extent. Since Kant's Critique of Pure Reason in 1781, philosophy has only rarely ventured outside this single gap between humans and the world. This is what philosophy has been all about. The paradox of how we jump across and gain knowledge of the world outside of us, or its denial that such a paradox exists, the claim that the human and the world are always already bound together, different ways of addressing the same gap. Not much has been said about the relation between 2 inanimate objects. This is left to the sciences. The sciences deal with this. Philosophy creates a kind of ghetto for itself, where it's dealing only with one kind of relation, human and worlds. The other kinds are left out of philosophy altogether. So that's one weakness that needs to be addressed. And specific entities treated mostly with contempt. Well, you may find resources in Heidegger for a philosophy of technology, but you'll have to deal with the fact that the gas chambers in Auschwitz, hydrogen bombs, Adidas shoes, and plastic cups are all essentially the same, he says, in these infamous statements. How do you go about addressing specific artifacts in the case of Heidegger? You find, obviously, a lot of this in Latour. You find this in people like McLuhan. There are many authors who do a nice job of dealing with specific entities and how they affect our perception of the world. You're not going to find too many resources for that in Heidegger. So that needs to be addressed. Latour. As you'll notice, the strengths and the weaknesses are inverted from Heidegger's. This is the interesting thing about it. Whereas Heidegger privileges human Dasein, Latour, despite some criticisms to the contrary, in spirit at least, allows agency to inanimate actors. There have been some claims that there's always a human observer present on the scene for Latour, and I can see why that's said. I tend to interpret that as being an artifact of his strategy to talk about philosophy of science. Since he's talking about philosophy of science so often, or philosophy of technology, of course there has to be a human there monitoring the interactions between the entities. But in spirit, Latour says, in the reductions, that entities translate each other the same way that we translate them, or the same way that we translate or interpret a text. In principle, two inanimate objects would interpret or translate one another. This has not been said in philosophy very often since Kant. I think Whitehead is really Latour's great model. Whitehead is the first one to simply say, we're going back to before the Kantian period in philosophy, we're going back to the 17th century. That's the strongest tradition that does that. It tries to leap outside of Kant's Copernican revolution altogether. Specific actors treated on their own terms. Well, Latour can talk about apricots, that's what he lectured on when he came to Cairo, when we invited him. He talked about how is the price of apricots in Paris determined. I don't think my colleagues appreciated that too much. My colleagues being Orthodox Kantians, Heideggerians, Viridians, I don't think quite saw the point of that, but I certainly did. In Sarasee this summer, there was a nice young lady writing her dissertation in Paris who's going to use actor networks theory to study volcanoes. I thought this is a wonderful application of Latour's principles. You cannot really do this with Heidegger. A Heideggerian study of volcanoes or of apricots is hard to imagine. So just to go back a second to Heidegger, you see the strength and the weaknesses are completely inverted here. Heidegger's strength, things not reducible to the relations, becomes, in my opinion, Latour's weakness. I think this is Latour's moment of excess. The thing is defined entirely by its relations. There's nothing in the thing, in the actor, that exceeds any of its current interactions with the environment. And I think this is a philosophical problem. It may not be a methodological problem in the human sciences, but metaphysically it's a problem. Whereas for Heidegger, you have the weaknesses, and he preserves the dominance of human being, and doesn't really have much to say about specific entities. Latour, quite the opposite. All actors are on the same footing for Latour, at least initially, and he's able to deal with very specific things in a way that Heidegger is not. So, they need each other's strengths. Heidegger's question of being, which I do interpret in an unorthodox way that I will try to justify here today, things are always deeper than their presence. Being is about withdrawal. The question of being is not so vague as people think it is in Heidegger. It's quite specific. He means that being is not presence at hand. Being is not something that manifests itself to anything else relationally. It's something deeper than any relation it has to anything else. It's not the standard reading of Heidegger, but I think it can be easily justified. And the great insight of Latour's actor network theory is that this priority of human Dasein vanishes. All the actors, in principle, are on the same footing. And so you can potentially go back to the pre-Kantian sort of metaphysics, while hopefully being able to withstand some of the critiques that Kant made, pre-Kantian metaphysics. I think these two strengths complement each other perfectly. And to me, the future of systematic philosophy comes from a Heidegger-Latour fusion. This is where I think it has to go. I think that the other great traditions, at least continental philosophy, that are emerging in systematic philosophy, namely Deleuze and Badiou, do not fully take into account what Heidegger saw. And I think this is going to cripple them. Okay, so this is what I propose. Philosophy needs to return to metaphysics in the sense of systematic philosophy and a philosophy about the world itself. And we will do this by way of a Heideggerized actor network theory. We have a network of translations, as in Latour, between cryptic veiled objects, as in Heidegger, my reading of Heidegger. Things are hiding, they're withdrawn, they're veiled, but they're doing this by interacting in a network in Latour's fashion. So let me just talk a little about Heidegger's tool analysis, a nice hammer. This is arguably the best known moment in 20th century philosophy, and certainly one of the most influential. I think it's completely misread as pragmatism. Heidegger's insight about tools, this was largely a critique of his mentor Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, who wanted to bracket or withhold, abstain from all questions about the external world outside of consciousness, and simply describe what appears in consciousness very minutely. Heidegger's point against this, which started appearing in his works when he was in his late 20s, early 30s for the first time, was that normally our manner of dealing with entities is not by looking at them. Normally it comes through using them. So an example would be the floor in this room, which none of you were probably thinking of until I mentioned it. You were simply standing on it. It was there because if it weren't there, you'd be hurtling through space, injuring yourself. The oxygen and the air that you're breathing, your bodily organs, by far the vast majority of the entities we are dealing with, we are simply relying on or taking for granted. And so they don't have to be tools in the narrow sense like hammers and screwdrivers. It can be the English language, which I'm using and you're all understanding without difficulty, I assume. English grammar is withdrawing into the background as you focus on the specific content of what I say, and not struggle with the grammatical structures. The usual way of reading this is in this pragmatist sense that there's this invisible background of practices that humans are involved in, and only from time to time, when we think or when tools break, do we rise above those practices and engage in theoretical behavior. So it's the old theory-praxis distinction. The problem with this way of reading Heidegger is that praxis also does not exhaust the being of the objects quite clearly. I mean, we are using the floor invisibly without thinking of it, but does that really make use of all the aspects of the floor? Obviously not. There are going to be things about the floor that are not relevant to our bodies. There are going to be smells that dogs can pick up from the floor. There are going to be electromagnetic vibrations that certain birds or mosquitoes perhaps can pick up from the floor. There might be other things that no living creature is currently equipped to detect. New sense organs that will evolve in the future in certain creatures that can pick up certain things about the floor that are not known. So praxis distorts the things just as much as theory does. And so we cannot read this as a difference between conscious and unconscious. This is the first thing. This is the way it's usually misread, I think. It has nothing to do with consciousness and unconsciousness. It has to do with our relation to something and the thing in itself. Controversial, but I think inevitable as a reading of Heidegger's tool analysis. And I'll even push it a step further in a few minutes. But that's enough for now. It's not a theory-praxis distinction. It's that theory and practice both distort the thing and turn it into a caricature. There's a depth to the thing that no human involvement with things can possibly detect. Okay, Latour. Oh, I should say one other thing about Heidegger, because I think this covers everything in Heidegger. I think the entire philosophy of Heidegger boils down to this. I don't just think this is a reading of the tool analysis. I think this is a reading of his entire philosophy. Because if you look at the question of the meaning of being, which is Heidegger's trademark, this is all it really means. All it really means is that being is what always withdraws. Any attempt to, in the history of philosophy, to define exactly what being is, turns out to be an oversimplification. It turns out to be a form of what he calls presence at hands, Vorhandenheit. It's an attempt to define being itself in terms of one particular being. Everything is water, or everything is atoms, or everything is power. Everything is the transcendental conditions of the human subject. Every philosophy, according to Heidegger, has chosen one specific kind of entity to represent them all. It's kind of the mascot for all being, which he thinks is impossible. This is ontotheology. It's ontotheology because it's ontology in the form of a theology that picks one specific being as its gods. And in a way, all of Derrida comes out of this. An attempt to show inconsistencies in Heidegger's, I'm not a great fan of Derrida, but in many ways he's simply trying to push Heidegger's critique of ontotheology more consistently and show that it still infects his philosophy even when he thinks it doesn't. So the question of being comes down to this, I think. And I also think there's no real turn in his philosophy. We were discussing this briefly beforehand. There's a large part of Heidegger's scholarship involves trying to determine what is the exact year when he had the famous turn in his thinking. His philosophy flipped around in a new direction. My claim is that there is none. My claim is that this says it all, and you can find new variants of this, ultimately into the strange form of the fourfold that I'll talk about at the end of today's lecture, but it's the same Heidegger from 1919 onward, I would say. I'm pretty radical about that, but I think there's no way to avoid that conclusion. Okay, Latour. If you were going to summarize Latour's philosophy, I had this problem a couple years ago, knowing how to start, and so I took the liberty of writing to Latour himself with a few thoughts about what his key philosophical principles are. And his answer surprised me, but it was interesting, and it now makes a lot of sense. And his answer was, you have to look at the Reductions, one of his lesser-known works, the second half of the Pasteurization of France. He called it an orphan book. No one's ever reviewed it. There's not been one review of it. And so I went back and reread it, and I saw that all of his philosophy really was contained there. It's written in this Wittgensteinian aphoristic style, 1.2.1.4, mixes in autobiography with jokes. And what he tells us in that book is that it all began for him in 1972 when he was in Burgundy teaching at a provincial lycée and was driving his van along the road, and it suddenly struck him, this sounds very Heideggerian, that every philosophy in the past is an attempt to reduce something to some higher principle, whatever it may be. And this sounds like Heidegger's critique of ontotheology, choosing one principle that explains the rest. And Latour decided to do the experiment of not reducing anything, taking all the actors on their own terms, not trying to decide what's real and what's unreal in the world, and simply seeing where that leads him. And eventually, 12 years later, it resulted in the Reductions, the book, which perhaps he should have published separately to give it more attention, rather than burying it as an appendix in the Pasteur book. I claim in my manuscript that there are four basic concepts of Latour's philosophy, which I forgot to put on a slide, I'm afraid, but they are actors, alliances, irreductions, and translation. And I'll just describe each of these briefly. Actors, of course, means anything that acts, anything that has an effect on other things. This could be the tooth fairy just as easily as it could be a rock or a weapon or the London Underground. It could be anything. And so in a way, Latour is there attacking the traditional theory that distinguishes between substances and aggregates. Latour does like Leibniz a lot. But one of the differences is that Leibniz makes a distinction between things that are real substances, which are generally things that exist by nature, and things that are mere aggregates of many pieces. And some of the examples are very funny. A pair of diamonds glued together, the circle of men holding hands, the Dutch East India Company, or any corporation, the London School of Economics, I suppose, would not be a real substance for Leibniz, whereas for Latour, sure it could be, because the London School of Economics can undertake actions that no individual here can. So that's actors. It's a new attempt to not make any distinction between what's real and what's unreal. So not everything's equally real for Latour. What makes something more real is strength, and strength comes from alliance. Something is more real the more allies it has. What makes quantum physics more real than witchcraft is not that quantum physics unveils the truth more directly than witchcraft for Latour, but simply that it's mobilized a larger network of supporters and of effects than witchcraft has been able to do. Irreduction, the third principle, is that nothing is either reducible or irreducible to anything else. You can reduce anything to anything else if you can make it hold, if you are willing to pay the price. You can do what Freud did and reduce dreams to wish fulfillments if you are willing to make a few sacrifices and if you are willing to pass a few key steps that show how the transformation is possible. There's always going to be a translation, and a translation always changes the thing. This is why I love one of my favorite metaphors in Latour is the industrial metaphor for truth instead of the optical one. This is in Pandora's Hope. Where he says instead of thinking of truth as something that's gradually unveiled, you think of truth as oil buried deep in Saudi Arabia that's gradually translated into gas in a tank in France. All the steps it has to go through, all the refineries, all the trucks that have to ship it. In each case, you're simply trying to preserve some essential core of the petroleum that's usable at the next stage. You're not unveiling the truth of the original petroleum. You're transforming it in such a way that it's usable. And I find this to be a very powerful metaphor for truth. Maybe my favorite one ever. And that's translation, the fourth of Nietzsche concepts in the book, in Irreductions, and in Latour's philosophy as a whole. It's any statement about anything is an oversimplification. And as he says repeatedly, there is no transport without transformation. To move something from its original location is to change it. Okay, now there are some problems with this. One of the problems is that actors are utterly concrete for Latour, and I would say too concrete. He says in Irreductions that everything happens in one time and one place only. In other words, a thing cannot be distinguished from its current environmental status or its current accidents. You cannot say here that this is a podium that can be picked up and moved to another building. For Latour, strictly speaking, it would then become a different thing. Because a thing is completely attached to all of its accidents, and its entire environment, and all of its relations. If you look back at the history of philosophy, you could say that substance, this traditional concept, what makes a real thing, it's a substance, it's distinguished usually from either its qualities, its accidents, or its relations. Okay, so relations, you can say, I am standing a certain distance from each one of you, and if I move a greater distance from each of you, I have, according to common sense, not changed. I'm the same person, I've changed my relation to all of you. Accidents, the fact that I'm wearing this shirt instead of the blue one, I could easily put on the other shirt today and been the same person. Qualities, I guess we're talking about more essential qualities then. Are there certain basic features of my personality that can be changed? Am I still remain the same? Well, within certain limits, yes. For Latour, really, there are no such distinctions between any of those three things. An actor is its exact sum total of all its relations, all of its accidents, and all of its qualities. And this allies him with the tradition in the history of philosophy known as occasionalism. And Latour was resisting this idea at first, but I think he's starting to see why he is one. Because the fact that an actor is so completely concrete and completely determinate and can only be moved to a different situation by way of translation, and translation always changes things, means that nothing is really mobile. Paradoxically, everything is frozen in a specific place and time, and to establish an identity between the same thing that's moved through different situations, which you can do in Latour, is what he calls a trajectory. If you want to show that the city of London has retained a certain identity over all the centuries since Roman times, yes, but it's obviously been transforming, it's been changing. You have to translate it and show at each of those steps how it's the same, how it's roughly within the same physical location. And that takes a third actor to do it. Any two things, he says, are linked only by a third thing. That's one of Latour's most profound ideas, I think. The best case history he gives of this is in Pandora's Hope when he's talking about Joliot and the French atomic bomb project, which was ended rather abruptly by the German invasion. Joliot linked politics and neutrons. Was he the first person in history to do this? Probably. Unless the American project was a few years behind. So Joliot probably was the first person to link the two. And it became clear to me that every actor is a kind of Joliot. Every actor is the only thing that can link two other actors. So for one thing to link to another, or one thing to transform into another, you need a third term mediating between them. And to go back to the occasionalist link again, in the history of philosophy, you have this issue that starting in Islamic theology in the 10th century in Iraq, you had among one school a very literal interpretation of one passage of the Quran where God is doing everything literally himself. No other actors are doing anything but themselves. And this had a certain life in Islamic theology for a few centuries before reappearing in France in Descartes' Quadrant Malebranche, where for Descartes, God has to intervene from my being able to move my own body. Since mind and body are two different kinds of substances, God must intervene to make that possible. For Malebranche, God must intervene even in inanimate collisions between two things. More back along the Arab way of looking at it. I would argue that Humean skepticism is merely the upside-down version of this. Because in Hume, who was a great admirer of Malebranche, you also have the problem of not being able to establish how cause and effect occurs. It's simply the reverse problem. For the occasionalist, you have all these independent substances out there, and you don't know how they link. And so God is brought in to link them. With Hume, in a sense, the things are already linked. They're linked in the mind as habits or as customs. The problem is showing whether they have any independence of our representation of them. So it's really just the upside-down problem. What ultimately excites me about Latour is I think he's the one who's going to get us out of this jam. I think Latour is the one who's going to be able to talk about the independence and the linkability of objects if we push him in a Heideggerian direction. I think Latour himself is too much about the networking, too much about the relations of things. By adding the Heideggerian dimension of withdrawal and invisibility and hiddenness and veiledness, this is how we start to escape from this occasionalist deadlock, the skeptical deadlock that led to Kant ultimately. So I think this is Latour gives us very important resources. This is a very interesting moment in the history of philosophy that he gives us. So, I've said that Latour talks about things in relational terms. He says that reality means resistance. A thing is real if it resists. A thing is real if it has effects on other things. You cannot say that there's a substance hiding behind the relations of the thing. You cannot say that a thing has potential right now that isn't actualized for Latour. Because to say that an acorn is potentially an oak tree, he thinks is to be lazy. It's to do all the work in advance, instead of following each of the transformations that the acorn needs to go through with water and with soil and with all the other actors to gradually transform itself into a tree. You cannot say that the tree is enfolded in the acorn. A whole crowd of allies is needed for that process to happen. And so too for any of us in our potentials. Latour simply condemns the term potentiality. He does not believe there is such a thing. Even in the case of logical proofs, or in the case of Euclid's geometry, he says all of Euclid's geometry is not potentially contained in the axioms. No one's ever done it that way. It's very difficult to go through each of the proofs. I've done it. I had a course on it for a whole year where we went through all of Euclid's proofs, and it is very difficult. So you can never be able to predict it. Just like a food is not in the recipe, potentially. There are certain transformations that have to go on. The recipe helps you know which transformations to go through, but the food is not potentially present in the recipe. Okay, now these, I think, are good points. The problem is there are difficulties with claiming that a thing is merely its relations. And these were seen all the way back Aristotle's time in the Metaphysics when he criticizes the Megarians. The Megarians were an ancient school of philosophers who I think we know about mostly from Aristotle's criticism of them, who said that there's no such thing as potentiality. Things merely are what they are right now. And so that if you are a house builder and you're not building a house right now, you essentially have the same status as someone who has no idea how to build a house, because neither of you are building right now. Aristotle found this completely counterintuitive. And some of the points Aristotle makes against this, one is that there's no reason for anything to change. One reason is that obviously, it's counterintuitive to say there's no difference between a builder who's not building right now and someone who has no idea how to build. It just doesn't seem right to us. Another problem is that why would anything change? If there's nothing held in reserve behind the world as it is right now, its current state of everything in the world, why would any of it ever change? If there's nothing behind it struggling to burst forth, creating tension in the current state of things, there would seem to be no obvious reason why one moment of time would lead to another moment of time. And Latour is an occasionalist, I would say. He's one of the modern occasionalists along with Whitehead's, in the sense that each moment of time is completely cut off from others, because you need to translate it to get to the next one. And each actor is completely cut off from the others, unless a third turn comes in and translates between the two. Everything is cut off, paradoxically. Latour, the great philosopher of networks and relations, leaves things frozen off in each other, in another sense. So, we need to get through to Heidegger to help remedy this problem. And I'm going to say that Latour's actors are one-folds because everything is attached together in the thing. Everything is bound up together in the thing. There's no fissures or crevices in the thing. Whereas for Heidegger, actors are fourfolds. put up Husserl, but I need to talk a little more about Heidegger first. Heidegger, one obvious element contained in his philosophy that is not contained in Latour's philosophy is this idea of things withdrawing from visibility. For Latour, it would make no sense to say that there's a hidden table behind the table and how it relates to us. Latour might add that the table has relations to all kinds of other actors in the environment, and all of those relations together make up the table. But there's nothing hidden for Latour. This is anathema to Latour. Hiddenness does not exist. There's a kind of immanence. Everything is on the same level of effects. Everything that affects anything else is real. The rest is rubbish. It's nonsense. It's not there. Whereas for Heidegger, the whole point is to point to a dimension that is not adequately expressed in the environment right now, that's hidden, that's veiled. And that's what I identified with the tool analysis. I simply said that I don't think it has anything to do with praxis. It has nothing to do with pragmatic use of things, because our pragmatic use of things also never touches the full depth of the thing. Well, Heidegger has a famous fourfold in his later philosophy. I've got a few slides on that later. That's what I'm building up towards. There are many fourfold structures in the history of philosophy. This goes all the way back to Plato's divided line and Aristotle's four causes. In medieval philosophy, we've got Ariuga's four different types of entities: created and incapable of creation, uncreated and capable of creation. I won't go through the whole thing. Bacon's four idols. In semiotics, you've got a semiotic square. In McLuhan, you've got four different aspects of artifacts. These are all different fourfolds. What they all have in common is they arise from two dichotomies that cross. Anytime you have that, you're going to get a fourfold structure in philosophy. And so the problem became how to understand what Heidegger's second principle of division was. Surprisingly, I don't think anyone else before me even attempted to explain what Heidegger's fourfold meant. It was considered poetic jargon. It was considered hopelessly embarrassing. Even strict Heideggerians would mention it briefly in a couple of sentences and then move on. They were too embarrassed to even talk about it. They said it had something to do with Uhlen's poems. It would never work out philosophically exactly what it meant. And so I started looking for it. And once you start looking for it, it becomes very obvious what it is. You have to be looking for it. Where it comes from is it comes from Husserl. We know that in Heidegger there's a difference between the veiled underground reality of things that withdraws and hides from us, and from not only from our theory but also from our practical actions. What about within the phenomenal realm? What about within the realm of visibility? Well, there is still a tension, and this is precisely what Husserl's entire philosophy is based on. Husserl lacks that grain of realism that you find in Heidegger's philosophy. Husserl is trying to describe things as they appear in consciousness. Despite what some of his followers claim that he's actually a realist, he's not. I'm sure of it. What you have in Husserl is the tension between a phenomenon, or an intentional object, an object in consciousness, and its qualities. If I circle around the desk and see it from different angles at different times, I'm not thinking that I'm seeing different objects at each instance. I'm focused on the same thing and merely seeing different profiles of it. So you've got a difference between a thing and its qualities within consciousness. This is Husserl's great discovery, I think. Whereas I've got British empiricism crossed out here because what's typical of Hume and Locke and Berkeley is the idea that a substance is merely something added on by the human mind to bundle together some qualities. There really isn't anything in the thing other than the qualities, and we somehow kind of arbitrarily put them together, but that's our work. That's not in the things themselves. Husserl's second logical investigation is nothing but a relentless onslaught against this tradition. And he says that consciousness is not made up of qualities, it's made up of objects. There are objects there, and we sort of subtract away the qualities and point at an underlying thing that stays the same, no matter how the qualities change. Now, this is different from Heidegger's dualism, because Heidegger's dualism is between visible things and invisible things. Husserl is simply talking about the visible layer. Heidegger's whole philosophy is designed to add that deeper layer to Husserl that's not there, the realm of real tools that never come to view. And so now in Husserl, I saw that we had this second principle of division, and this is really where the fourfold comes from. You've got a difference between the thing and its qualities on the visible level. You've got the same difference between the thing and its qualities on the hidden level. And so you've got a rupture within the objects themselves, or within the actors themselves, that the Latour does not allow for. Okay, now why is this important? Let's see what my next slide is. Let's push Heidegger one step deeper. I've already said that Heidegger should not be read as saying there's a difference between praxis and theory. He's saying that the things themselves are even deeper than praxis. Well, here's the controversial point, but the inevitable one. We have to push Heidegger in the direction of saying that things also distort each other. Inanimate things also distort each other. It's not just humans that do this. It's not just some quirky feature of human theory or praxis that distorts the things. Relation itself does this. If one thing smacks into another, if fire is burning cotton, the same thing happens. Fire is not going to react to the smell of the cotton. It's not going to react to whether or not there are small insects in the cotton. The fire, I'm not saying it's conscious, I'm not a panpsychist, but I'm saying that fire does not react to all aspects of the cotton. It oversimplifies the cotton in order to burn it. The cotton itself is far richer than any flammability that the fire encounters. And so inanimate objects also do this to each other too. So it's not, in a way, Heidegger's tool analysis doesn't tell us anything about the specific features of human being. It pushes it down to a far more abstract ontological level and talks about the difference between objects and relations. That's what it's really about in my reading. And you have to expand that to say that it's about all interrelations whatsoever. This is not completely new because you see this in Whitehead's. The problem is Whitehead cheats, unlike Latour. Whitehead says, how do things translate each other? They must do it by means of universal qualities, which Whitehead calls eternal objects. So if there's the same green in many different shirts, all the entities are using this, they're borrowing this green from somewhere and using it to oversimplify this man's shirt, which actually has many different aspects to it, and my eyes are somehow oversimplifying it with universal green. And where is this green contained? It's contained in gods. It's the old-fashioned occasionalism. Latour, despite being a fairly pious Catholic, does not have recourse to gods at any key point of his philosophy. He makes the translations local. For to be able to translate his shirt into a specific color, it does not pass through God. It simply has to do with my eyes and him. And so it's a kind of secular occasionalism, the first secular occasionalism in history. There's an indirect relation between two things, but it's not at the level of God. It's not at the level of the human mind. It somehow happens in any relation between any two objects at all. So, how I read presence at hand. Presence at hand in Heidegger's book, Being in Time, has to do with what happens when a tool breaks. It becomes consciously visible. It becomes theoretically approachable. I simply read it as being more abstract and deeper, as referring simply to the relationality of things. Anything that shows up in any kind of relation, whether it's a physical causal relation, a theoretical one, a perceptual one, is simply not the thing itself. The thing itself is always going to be never quite grasped by any relation to it. And this, to me, is the central problem raised by Latour's philosophy. His actors, though, are one-folds, because both of the two principles of division that we find in Heidegger are missing. There is no deep, veiled, hidden, withdrawn realm of reality for Husserl. He'd laugh if you asked him if he believed in that. For Latour, things are real if they have effects. So if they're somehow on this plane of action, where all the things in the world are exerting forces on each other, there's nothing hidden. And also, an actor is not different from its accident to its relations. The fact that I am this specific distance from the people in the front row is definitive for who I am as an actor for Latour. If I move here, I'm a different actor. Everything happens in one time and one place only. Some Latourians think that's too extreme, but he's quite clear about it in the reductions. The thing happens in one time and one place only. To show that a thing has identity over time, this is the British empiricist tradition, the Whiteheadian tradition that Latour follows. You have to draw a trajectory across all those different moments and show that there's an essential identity between them. There's not an enduring substance for Latour. And as I said before, in the case of Aristotle's critique of the Hegelians, it's unclear. Everything is completely expressed as what it is at any moment. And nothing is hidden. I have no hidden potential. It's unclear how I can change. How can I change? The other problem is, since relations for Latour only occur through mediators, only through third terms, and if it's Joliot who links politics and neutrons, who links Joliot and politics, and who links Joliot and neutrons? There would have to be a term in between those linking them. And who would link those? And who would link those? So it would be an infinite regress. You would never be able to explain relations at all if you followed Latour. Because there would always be a new mediator inserted between any 2 points, no matter how close they were. Now we have Heidegger's fourfold actor. Every entity is partly hidden, because you can never completely grasp it, whether you're human, animal, inanimate. You are never going to completely exhaust the depths of the thing. An actor, which is a term that Heidegger doesn't use, of course, he would say an entity, is in tension with its accidents and relations, because it would somehow be deeper than them, as Husserl saw. A thing is not the same as whatever profile you happen to be seeing it from. It's deeper than that. The problem, apparently Pompous pseudo-poetic terminology. This is the problem with Heidegger's fourfold actor. If you read it, you can't make heads or tails of it unless you work for several years on it, which took me about 3.5 years to figure it out once I started. Otherwise, it just sounds like he's pulling random poetic terminology out of Hölderlin's hymns. And I've got a chart here here it is, fourfolds. Heidegger called the product launch. Around in December 1949 is when Heidegger unveiled his fourfolds. It was present much earlier in his philosophy, simply not under that name. I found it all the way back in 1919 in his reading of Husserl. But it first takes this name in 1949, Earth, Sky, Gods, and Mortals. So there are sometimes attempts to say Heidegger's talking about the holy because there are gods here, but the gods here turn out to have nothing at all to do with gods in the real sense. These four terms are found in any entity at all, any object at all, any actor at all has these four terms. I should say there's circumstantial evidence for this being very important to Heidegger's career. This lecture is so ignored. It's actually 4 short lectures totaling about 3.5 hours. It hasn't even been fully translated into English yet. But if you've read much Heidegger in the later period, you know some of this work because it's been cut up into a lot of spin-off essays. There is the question concerning technology. It's one of the 4. The Thing is another one of the 4. The other 2 I don't think survive in short form. The Danger and the Turn are the other 2. This was his first public appearance after the war. And so he was saving something very special for this. And all of the work from the 1950s on language and all the stuff about technology and the Thing comes directly from this set of lectures. So there's all this talk about what's Heidegger's second major work after Being in Time. People usually want to say it's the Contributions to Philosophy, which I think is pretty awful, actually. It was half-baked and needed some more work. Some people want to say it's those lectures on boredom and animal life from 1929 and 30. Interesting, but failed. This is really the second masterwork. And I've heard it's being translated into English. It's called Einblick in das Was ist, or Insight into What Is. It should be out in a couple of years in English, I hope. Here's the charts. This is what Heidegger's fourfold means. Here you have the visible worlds. Here you have this concealed, withdrawn world of tools. So I've got tools here, broken tools. Readiness to hand, Zuhannenheit, Vorhandenheit, presence at hand. This is the concealed world for Heidegger, the revealed world. So you've got these two, and then how do you split between these two? This has to do with the specific qualities of things, and this has to do with the unity of things. Although for Heidegger it's a little different. For Heidegger it's the unity of the world as a whole. Why is it mortals? Because mortals are the ones who experience death as death, he says. And death frees us from all particular beings. The angst we experience when we comport ourselves towards death reveals the world as a whole, no longer split up into individual beings. Whereas the way he describes sky in all of these essays has to do with particularity of things, the specific features. Now, I simply use Husserl's version of this instead of Heidegger's. For Husserl, each individual thing belongs here, not the world as a whole. I would say that there is no world as a whole. Whereas Heidegger thinks this term refers to totality. And Earth also, when he talks about Earth, it's always in the singular. Earth is this hidden force that gathers and shelters and spreads its juices out throughout everything. Whereas this has to do with particularity. It doesn't have to do with gods literally, any more than this has to do with Earth literally. So something up in the sky also is characterized by Earth. It's not that things way up in the sky are the sky and things down here are Earth, and Indra and Wotan and Zeus are gods and people are mortals. Heidegger never writes philosophy in that sense. He doesn't split things up into 4 specific kinds of objects. These are 4 dimensions present in every object. Okay. Now, we get to the plasma in Latour. Something that Peter has reminded me of the importance of. This appears, I think, only in his new book, Reassembling the Social, this introduction to action network theory that he wrote. This seems to be Latour finally seeing that he can't account for things purely in relational terms. He doesn't go into this as much as he should in the new book. Plasma, he says, if networks were the size of the London Underground, plasma would be the remainder of London. Now, if you know Latour well, this is a shocking statement. Because normally it's hard to see anything existing outside of networks for Latour. Everything is relational. Everything gains its reality only from allies. And now suddenly, maybe it's Latour who had a turn and not Heidegger. Maybe Latour is entering his career. Networks now turn out to be a very small size of reality, and plasma is this kind of unthematized, rumbling, dark outside. How do we know it's there? We know it's there because networks collapse very suddenly. That's what it says in the book now. Why does the Soviet Union vanish overnight without anyone predicting it? Why does... It's got a nice page full of examples. Why do networks, which seems fully sleek and deployed sometimes, and fully articulated, all the elements articulated with respect to one another, why do networks suddenly collapse? Well, it's because there are forces emerging from the plasma. And this is its strength. Its strength is that it can help solve the problem Latour has with knowing how networks can ever change. There is a weakness, however, and the weakness is that he doesn't seem to think the plasma has any articulation, or at least I can't detect that in his books. He seems to think the plasma is just this big lump, and every now and then it surges up and creates atmospheric effects in the visible world, in the world of actors. And I don't like this because I've already been through this with Levinas, who's otherwise one of the great readers of Heidegger. Levinas also thinks being itself is a big rumbling whole, and only human consciousness breaks it into parts, which is completely counterintuitive, of course. the idea that the world itself is unarticulated until I break it up into pieces. So it seems to be maybe Latour is slipping into Levinas's problem with this when he says the world as a whole is simply sleek. And this goes all the way back to pre-Socratic philosophy. They had the apeiron, which was completely indeterminate until for Anaxagoras, nous, mind, started spinning it in a circle very fast and it broke into pieces. So it's actually a pre-Socratic idea that only the mind gives things determinacy. And so I would say this is why the plasma won't quite do it unless Latour adds some articulateness to the things prior to their becoming involved in relations. It might be a step too far for him, but that's what he has to do. It's a nice map of the underground. Look how small the networks are. You have all this space in and above London. All this plasma, it cannot be mapped. So what we need is a Latourianized fourfolds. We need to steer Latour away from this idea that the actor is completely defined by all of its traits, that an actor is completely defined by all of its relations. We need to rediscover the substance of things. We need to rediscover that actors have a determinacy that is not fully articulate in any moments. In fact, it's much vaster, like the plasma, than any of its visible effects on other things, or any of its invisible effects on other things. Something that characterizes actors so deeply and yet is never fully expressed. But unlike Latour's plasma, it's not this global rumbling force. It simply surges up and affects all the networks, but it has parts. You have real objects that are not entirely involved in relations, that are not entirely involved in alliances. These are my very dramatic final slides. Heidegger's future is Latour, Latour's future is Heidegger. And I wish Latour were here now in the front row so that I could see his eyebrows. I would be appalled by this. Sorry?
As with Heidegger, if he was sitting.
As with Heidegger, yes. I cannot imagine Heidegger reading Latour either. At least in Latour's case, we can empirically test it and find that he doesn't have any interest. When I first got to know Latour, he decided, since he had met me, to reread Being in Time for the first time in 20 years. Should I not be saying this on tape? He reread Being in Time and just didn't get much out of it, which is very surprising. Because the commonalities are strong enough that many of us independently came to see that there are some common links that should be built between them. But Heidegger might even be more appalled. I cannot imagine Heidegger liking any one of Latour's books. And there's that wonderful part of We Have Never Been Modern, where he's mocking Heidegger's philosophy of technology, but here too the gods are present, in Adidas shoes no less than in hand-carved wooden clogs, in shopkeepers' calculations no less than in Holderlin's heart-rending verse. It's one of the wonderful sarcastic passages of contemporary philosophy. So that is the last slides, and I will now take your questions. I don't want to get into the mechanics of the fourfold here, which is what my next book is about. This is not a philosophy audience, but if you want to find out more about that, I'm at work on a manuscript now called Object-Oriented Philosophy. It's trying to do exactly what I laid out here today in the talk. It's a Heideggerianized Latour or Latourized Heidegger. We'll see what Latour thinks. This is not the manuscript that's available for circulation. This one won't be done for another 7 or 8 months. But if you want to see my manuscript on Latour and on Latour's metaphysics, I'm willing to send that to anybody because I want as many of you to see it as possible before Latour does. I want to be insulated psychologically from his reactions, whether they're good or bad. So please request it if you want. And with that, I will take your questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the fascinating and thought-provoking talk. Can we have questions? Jonathan, please.
I just started out. Can you go back over the consequence of your integration for concepts of change? Because I still don't see how you ridiculed the plasma as a mechanism for change, and you don't see where it is in Latour at all. So importing Heidegger into it doesn't seem to solve it yet, as you described it. Can you run past it?
Oh, I don't think I ridiculed it. I just don't think it's going to work any more than Levinas's definition of being is an unarticulated lump works. It's certainly a new concept in Latour. I don't remember any other places in his prior works where he hinted at it. So it's something novel, and I'm glad that he's moving in that direction. Where you find something a little better in Heidegger is in the moment of gods. The fact that things are articulated. Things are not simply earth. They're not one unified empire. Things are broken up into parts. There are actors at the pre-relational level. Now, where you go with that, I wanted to stay away from some of the mechanics of this, but I think what you have to end up doing is saying that there is a place where actors can meet. It doesn't involve an infinite regress of third terms coming in between, and that is on the interior of a third object. The interior of a third object, with the best example of that, but a strange one, being perception, or human consciousness, or intentionality in general. Because here I am a real thing, making contacts with perceptual things without fusing into them. There's a kind of proximity here in perception. With the real me and exaggerated caricatures of all of you that I'm seeing, this has to be the model. The model, the inside of any intentional relationship, at least the human one, and I think all, you've got a real perceiver making contact without fusing into perceptual things. I think that's the only place contact can occur. And that's a very knotty problem. But as far as your question about how Heidegger adds to this?
Now, how are you going to get Latour to have an explanation of change? Intentionality will do it in a very narrow sense. I don't think that it's going to give us a general concept of how change occurs in a complex structure, an organization like the LSE.
It can if you broaden intentionality to also include the relations between inanimate objects, which is becoming more and more common. It's not by any means a majority view yet, but physical intentionality is becoming a little more acceptable in some quarters. I don't know if you can get Latour's philosophy in its current form to account for change. I think he's stuck in the same position the Hegelians were. I think that's going to be a permanent weakness unless he really had a turn. He really radicalized what he thinks the plasma is. And maybe he can. I just don't see him he doesn't seem plagued by this problem. He doesn't seem to worry about how change occurs. Yes?
On the same issue, I mean, it seems to me that your description of actors in actor network theory is a bit sort of one-dimensional, because you didn't speak about the idea of black boxes and above all installed base, which is where the historicity really comes in. And it's surely when some installed base actually doesn't hold together anymore that the breakthroughs and the changes happen. I'm also thinking of what Calonne has done with the hard and cold controversies. Some of the sort of people who study, say, markets and economics, it's very easy to see how a small breakdown in a minor, tiny little component then sort of propagates through very rapidly and links lots of previously separate actor networks into that particular breakdown. I think it's sort of fairly intuitive how change is explained.
Well, I think he merely presupposes it. Okay, the installed base breaks down. Why would it break down? If you really had a system, if you really had a model of the world where everything was completely defined by its relations, why would those relations ever change? It's defined by its relation to them. They're defined by its relation to it. And so if you want to get into the metaphysics of it, there's really no reason why we would ever move from one state to another. And that's what I was trying to explain.
But I think this is why he's sort of always very keen to sort of quote Hughes and the reverse salience and these kind of things. I think when one starts to look at empirical evidence of these things, it's quite easy to see how they happen, whether it's in IT or in other kind of technological settings. Old components that no longer can keep up with some of the other breakthroughs that happen in the one that they're related to.
Right. If you look around the world, it's easy to see these changes happening. The question is how you explain it philosophically. And I don't think the model of defining things completely as relations is going to work. I think there has to be something in the things outside of the relations for any changes ever to happen. So I agree that his methodology functions brilliantly without ever really addressing this question. But he aspires to be a metaphysician. He says this more and more all the time. And if he does, this is a question that needs to be addressed by his philosophy. And it's one where he's got to answer objections. So I think that it's merely presupposed rather than explained how changes occur. As for black boxes, you want to say something first about that?
Just on the same point, I've read some of the recent things he wrote in an article, actually on a Greek website, but about this idea of explication, how actually by pushing your network outwards, you're actually revealing the world in greater and greater detail.
Right.
And that is actually, through the process of actually trying to expand the network, you are actually revealing the world, revealing hidden properties of objects, etc.
Right, but then again, you're really presupposing that an actor is able to push out. We know from experience that actors always are constantly pushing out and things are not staying the same. But how do you explain this if you start by defining an actor as completely determinate in terms of its current relations? There's simply no reason why, if I'm defined by my relations to all of you now, that I would be able to enter a new state of relations to you a moment from now. If there's nothing in me held in reserve behind those relations, there's no substance at all. It's philosophically incoherent, I would say. And I think it's a question he has to answer. As far as, you want to say something else about that? I want to get back to the black boxes.
Just on that point, though, because I think ontologically that's a key point, because he's not saying that there isn't a reality out there. I think he presupposes there is, but it's actually the social construction comes in the way we understand that reality. So therefore, it's always there, and we're always going to reveal something more of it as we find new ways of explaining it to ourselves and using it in our interactions. This whole sort of translating from things to human, from the world of things to the world of humans, that whole sort of relationship and all the translations that go into that. For example, the Amazonian earth scientists.
Yes. Did you want to?
Oh, sorry, I don't mean to be rude. It's just a few more questions so I'll let you answer that.
I'll just answer this one. For me, the problem is not that Latour doesn't say there's a reality out there. I think those criticisms of Latour from mainstream science people are not quite getting at the heart of the matter. For me, the point is not that he's an anti-realist, it's that he's a relationist. There is a reality out there, but it's completely defined in relational terms. And that's what I'm addressing. I've never claimed in this talk today that he's not a realist. I think he is. I think there's some moments where he slips away from that. It's like when he says that the tuberculosis bacillus couldn't have killed Ramses II because it wasn't discovered yet, and so you can't say that he was killed by tuberculosis any more than by a machine gun. That's okay. Those are moments I think where he slips. I don't think that's really the core of his position. The core of his position is similar to Whitehead's. It's that you have a metaphysics of relations. And again, if a thing is defined solely by its relations, I just don't see any way to move from one step to the next. I think that's a problem with all such theories. As for black boxes, I didn't mention them, but they were present in my talk because I talked about how actors is one of Latour's major concepts, which means you have actors of all different sizes, all different levels, which means they're all black boxes. You can always open them and look at the components, whereas you don't have that in Leibniz because there's only one kind of black box, that's the monads. There's not different sizes of them.
Yes, Antonio.
Yeah, let's say same way of thinking as it was addressed before. One of my problems with Latour, and I think that has been a little bit overcome by John Law, is the ontological and epistemological distinction of the relational dimension and the nature of actors and networks.
And the what?
The nature of actors and networks.
Yeah.
The way in which I read actor-network theory is that the ontology is in the relational dimension. And
right.
So in one way, actors do not pre-exist the relationship. This is one of the assertion of John Law. And that is my usual critiques to presenting ANT, I'm sorry, as you did today, saying that human and non-human are presented at the same level. Actually, they do not exist. They do not pre-exist interaction. And so if we present this distinction between human and non-human, you're assuming an ontological essence of humans and non-humans that I think is not part of ANT from an ontological viewpoint.
Oh, I don't think I was assuming an essence. I'm just saying that any actor you can think of is on the same level as any other. You can't start with a pre-existing hierarchy.
Well,
of
then on this question is, to me, the ontological essence of ANT is in the relationship. So you are what you are in the moment of time in which you are.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is the epistemological dimension that is, how do we study it? And that is where Latour says we can only trace back actors, but we cannot see the dynamics that is shaping the actors.
Mm-hmm.
At least this is what he has been saying for quite a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is, if we make a distinction and we say that, for example, the network is an epistemological approach to study the relationships, and actors are, or black boxes are a way to define epistemologically the object of the study, but not to define it ontologically wise, are we not able to supersede this distinction between, the relationships and the actors that it seems being part of the core of your argument, and posing the ontological focus on the relationships, so that in one way we are not anymore in a situation where objects are studied or conceived outside the relationships?
I think it simply shifts the problem, because if you have a relationship, in many ways you have another kind of objects. Why? Because what are the real features of an object? The traditional features of an object, I would say, are wrong. Durability, physical hardness, other such features. What really characterizes an object, I think, is something that can have different attributes at different times, as Aristotle says. That's what makes a substance. Something that can have different relations, something that's never exhausted by its relations, And I think all that is true of a relation. If you have a real relation between two things, it can be viewed from different ways from the outside. But then is that relation only defined in terms of its relation to other things? So I think it just pushes the problem another step further. At some point, you've got to have a reality that's not where you're not passing the buck and defining it in terms of some other relation. There's got to be some reality of things that isn't just defined by the outsides. And I don't see how you're going to get out of that problem if you take this step. It's just going to get more extreme.
The way in which I read INT, and then I stop because I know there are other people, and maybe we can discuss later on, is that the problem of the relationship is and that I think Latour is saying it as well. We artificially define the dimension of the network. Now the point is that if we analyze everything is in this room, can be clearly interconnected to other relationships that are shaped or characterized, let's call this object in this way. And to me, it's almost impossible, ontologically wise, to define where an object finishes and the other one starts.
Mm-hmm.
And then is the relationship to me is the ontological essence in one way. And objects do not exist outside relationships. And relationships do not exist outside object. And I think this is the key definition of John Law, where the two things do not pre-exist each other's. And then it's only the relationship that is shaping them.
I'm not sure that Latour even thinks they pre-exist each other. That's one of my problems with him. If you're saying that everything exists in one time and one place only, it can't exist until it exists. It can't exist until its set of relations is activated, and then it exists. And yes, it does seem to have some relation to something that happened immediately before, but there's only a trajectory linking them. And the two
but to me that is an epistemological distinction because we can study the continuous. But time is not, we cannot actually, we can only artificially distinguish moments of time.
That sounds like Bergson. Latour is the anti-Bergson, I think.
No, but I'm not supporting. I had a long discussion about this with Latour. But the point is, what you're saying is artificial. You're saying time, and you're making time, clearly defined. But how can you define?
He's the one who does that, not me. I don't agree with it. He says in Irreductions very clearly that a thing is completely defined by all of its concrete attributes.
But I think John Law is not saying that.
Okay, I don't know law as well, so I'll have to take your word for it.
Okay.
But it sounded to me like Law was saying that even more, based on what you said. If you're saying that Law thinks a thing only exists as soon as it relates, and more extreme a form of Latour.
Well, the point is the relationship is always shaping and reshaping. So there is not a moment of time, if not as an artificial way to study the past.
Okay, but then you have to bring in some sort of notion of flux or becoming that's outside of a specific state of the actors, and you have to establish that philosophically too. That's what Bergson and Deleuze do. That has different problems. That has different problems.
Alexei?
Kind of comment on your presentation. Obviously, I'm not able to comment your content, and I'm happy to see so many of our senior academics here to kind of enter the discussion. We heard here, I think, very kind of excellent philosophical reading of Latour, and because we have a lot of students here, and actor network theory is obviously when we start our PhD, this is kind of one option that, okay, I take actor network theory and I apply it, and I think it was not probably on your agenda, but you make it very nicely clear that actually Latour is philosophically quite sophisticated and requires quite a lot of kind of anybody who was going to apply it has to do his or her homework very carefully, because I like it, and I have to say that in your manuscript it's the best introduction to Latour I have ever read, and the clearest introduction. But on the other hand, I have to say that I'm bugged by very many empirical case studies that say that they apply actor network theory. And when you read it, kind of, where's the actor network theory? Even I can see that there is very little Latour there. So I think you give a very good lesson in that sense that if we are going to apply this theory to empirical world, we have to do a lot of homework first here. And I can recommend that the first part of your book for anybody who wants to go into actor network theory. It's a very good introduction to it.
Right, as many people may know, Latour did start as a pure philosopher by training. This was his early education, very classical Jesuit philosophy education. The detour occurred when he was in Africa, when he met Guillemin, who invited him to San Diego to Salk's lab, and this is when he started doing the anthropology of the sciences. And so he simply hasn't been working much on the kinds of things philosophers usually work on, history of philosophy texts. But that's still really how he wants to see himself. And I think one of the reasons he's excited about the event in February is that he doesn't get treated as a philosopher very much. And that's how he sees himself. That's how he sees his work shaping up as his legacy. There was a question back here.
Thanks. Sorry, if you don't mind, if that was first.
Okay, just if you can go back to this question of potentiality and explain it a little bit more, because as you said, Latour condemns that anything has a potential. But could we assume from an actor network perspective that relations do have potential to evolve and change? And in this sense, as you are saying that the relation and the connection in itself is an actor.
I think experience shows us that things obviously do change. And the question is, how does he account for it? Potential is the way he rejects to account for it.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes.
I didn't really understand it.
It was about potential, and it was about whether...
The relation do have potential to evolve and change?
Yeah.
Don't
networks have the potential to evolve and change? Well, empirically, yes. Now, how does Latour account for this? He doesn't do it through the route of potentiality, because he thinks this means something is implicitly contained and it's merely unfolding, and it's a very un-Latourian idea. For him, you change by forming other alliances. So the acorn, to become a tree, forms other alliances. It doesn't, from within, unfolds. There may be something in there that allows it to move on to the next stage of its development, but it's not a potential, it's hidden in the thing. And he goes so far, as I pointed out, to say that even about basic logical deductions, that one logical deduction is not contained in another. This is why he really loves this new book by Raviel Netz about the origin of Greek geometry. I don't know if people know this. This is Latour's favorite book now. It's about the origin of Greek deductive reasoning in geometry, in which this guy is claiming, among other things, that the diagram is essential. The diagram is not just there as a random prop, but the diagram is a medium of translation. The proofs in Greek geometry are not implicitly contained in the axioms, that you have to work very difficultly to make the translation from one step to another. So even there, Latour sees potentiality as not working in logical deduction, which is a pretty extreme claim. You can't a priori deduce things.
A really practical understanding.
Right.
So how do you then methodologically study? If everything is just a one place, one time, I know that that's the issue of the Latour's thing, but I'm not convinced, and I don't understand how Heidegger is going to help us come out. I don't see how it only happens in one place, one time. I know Latour says that, but he often says things, and then he moves around, and then he says something else. And the problem then becomes always vacillating between different arguments, which I find infuriating sometimes as well.
Yeah.
He doesn't always say the same thing. So how does your idea help methodology? I mean, you're practical researchers, so how do you do it?
Right. I was actually wondering what I was going to say before this talk if somebody asked that, because I was hoping you would help me. It's better than last year, though, when I was at the AA, Architectural Association, and they turned to me and said, so how does object-oriented philosophy apply to this bicycle path? And I really had no idea. That was really embarrassing. But in this case, I suppose you would have to find some methodological way to account for something in the things that resists their current application. I really don't know. I can't offer any concrete proposals for how to change your methodology of A&T to account for Heidegger's withdrawn objects. I wish I could. Maybe one of you will be the ones to tell me how to do this. I really hope. Yes.
Sorry, Lucas.
Thank you, Ryan. That was fantastic. I just want to actually pick up some of that point and your point as well. And also, I think it's we shouldn't fall into the trap of if everything is defined by its relations, then we focus on the relations and then constitute the relation as a different object that now needs study. So we turn the relation into some substance that now needs to be studied, because that's one of the problems in terms of how people have applied actor network theory. Is applying actor network theory then becomes a way of finding relations and describing relations, etc., etc. And it seems to me that would be Latour rightly would be horrified by such a move, because that would exactly turn the relation into an object. And the relation is always enacted. There's always translation. There's always work needed. The relation is not there. The relation needs to be worked out through this translation. That's ongoing. That always requires another actor. to do the translation. So in that sense, I think I'm just in terms of guarding against the idea of now, if there is no actor, it's only a relation. Let's go find the relations. You see what I mean?
But isn't this what a black box is? A black box is a set of relations that has somehow become constituted more or less as an actor in its own right.
Right.
And that's obviously important for the tour. I mean, we can open up the black box and look at it anytime we want. What is the danger you see exactly?
The danger seems to me is exactly to turn the black box into some substance that is the black box, and the way to understand the black box is to find the relations, and then we try and find the relations. Mm-hmm. But all we're going to find is other black boxes, other actors.
That's right.
Right. We're not going to find the relation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because I know Latour always, in terms of the graph idea, he always goes ballistic when you start to draw bubbles and lines between the bubbles. And so there's the actors, and the line is the relation. Mm-hmm. And then we say, well, where's the relation? We have to find the relation. We have to account for it, describe it, or whatever. So it's not bubbles with lines, mm-hmm. right? It's just bubbles within bubbles within bubbles
That's
within
right.
bubbles.
Exactly.
And every bubble is a new actor.
Yes.
Right. So I'm just, in terms of applying it, that's one of the dangers in the way which people think about it. Mm-hmm. And also the point you made about the
and I guess this is the way how scientific facts are constructed. I mean, in the sense that they are black boxes, like facts that construct
Right. But just in terms of the general problem of using these ideas, what we mustn't forget is that the theory is an actor, and that the work to apply it is a process of translation that needs work, mm-hmm. right? That the theory is, or the ideas are not things in themselves, mm-hmm. which now needs to be now needs to be interpreted and made specific mm-hmm. in concrete instances or concrete examples. Mm-hmm. So the empirical and the theoretical, the divide which these ideas exactly goes against, mm-hmm. is underlying the idea of applying the theory to some empirical examples. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a dangerous route to talk about applying actor network theory.
It's an unfortunate word, isn't it?
Yes, very.
Applying, you mean?
Applying or using. I wonder very often, how do we change our vocabulary not to get into this awful trap of mechanistically somehow, I mean, the words do simplify the mistakes you make. We apply, we use theories. How else can we talk about that? How do you philosophers refer to the thinking through?
I guess it's not as big a problem for us because we rarely apply anything to anything. Because of our vices, we escape this problem.
One of the most troubling ideas in Latour's work in the IS community appears to be, not for me, but I see everybody else agonize it. I guess not for me because I don't know, my mind doesn't reach that far. But you triggered that, I suppose. But the thing that is more difficult for people to accept, somehow it offends them, mm-hmm. is the physical intentionality. Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit about that and how, in a way, that Heideggerian Latourian fusion might address that, or if it addresses that at all?
I've been shocked by this too. I had a friend of mine refused to read Latour because of the term negotiation. He said Latour's anthropomorphizing all the inanimate actors just because he says negotiation.
Yes.
It's purely metaphorical. Think about this, negotiating a curve. Obviously, inanimate objects are capable of some sort of agency because you can't do the same things when they're there as when they're not there. I don't know why there's this tendency to confuse agency with consciousness. This is why, in my own work, I try to go down to a way more bare-bones level than consciousness. Why build consciousness into the very fabric of the universe as one of the two basic structures, any more than backbones or glass or any other big jump in the history of the worlds? The appearance of amphibians or stars. Why is it that consciousness seems so special and important to people that they have to put it into the starting point of philosophy as one of the two basic kinds of things that exist, either inanimate collisions or consciousness? I don't think there is any reason to do that. So I share your puzzlements. over why this bothers people so much. The other interesting thing about Latour is that he gets attacked from opposite directions for opposite reasons, which I think is usually a good sign. I can claim the responsibility for urging him to write that Why His Critique Went Out of Steam article, because I was telling him in America he's viewed too much as just another French relativist who's turning everything into social construction. And he was strangely surprised by that. I'm surprised that he was surprised after the so-called hoax and everything. But he said, no, he's used to being attacked in France by the Bourdieuians as being a sellout, fossilized, arch-reactionary realist. That's the side he gets attacked from in France more often. Than in America, it's the other direction. So I think that's a very good sign. As far as how to convince people that inanimate agency is not a problem, I have the same issue in my own conversations with people.
Didn't we get something there from Heidegger's view about something more deep beyond the appearances?
Yes. And I should say that I don't think there's a turn in Heidegger, but he does become more consciously aware of this possibility, because in Being and Time, the tools really are completely defined by Dasein, and the system of tools links together in a way that serves my life, and this is what their meaning is. But then if you go to the Thing, he specifically says that the jug that holds the wine is specifically not that. It was produced by someone, but that's accidental. It's not. It doesn't exist because it was produced. It was produced only because it is. And now that it is, it holds the wine and cradles the wine. And so it does have agency, obviously, even for Heidegger. Yes?
Maybe just on the agency,
Yeah.
I mean, you gave the example of the floor. And I think that
floor
as something that clearly affects what we're doing in this room. We wouldn't be on the fifth floor if it wasn't.
That's right.
So I think that kind of Heideggerian explanation for all of these things that we relate to but don't intentionally think of might be a way of at least presenting that particular aspect. Rather than the kind of intentionality. The floor is not intentionally holding us up, but it clearly relates to us. We relate to it in that kind of indirect, hidden way. We're all here on this fifth floor rather than on the ground.
That's right. That Heideggerian way of looking at it is very helpful. And you just reminded me of something else that puzzles me, which is that people always swing from one extreme to the other. Either there's this Cartesian dualism where everything's either thinking mind or unthinking substance, or else thinking must be everywhere. Even the floor must be thinking. Panpsychism, which is coming back in fashion again. I've seen a few books out about this now. Yeah, amazingly. And
I'm sorry, Giovan Francesco was waiting for a question.
Latour uses the notion of negotiation metaphorically, as I believe he uses many other concepts metaphorically, like translation, and even the notion of actor probably is a metaphor. But then the question I have, and also the source of my perplexity, which I am very cautious when I read Latour and because I don't like to be trapped too much, and I think it's a way of trapping me. And it isn't a metaphorical core in the way that Latour organizes his own thinking and his own way of dealing with the materials he's dealing with. A metaphorical core that it seems to me it comes mostly from semiotics, Greimas, and I mean, I wonder whether that could help us in making decisions, whether these analysis and interpretations about the credibility, of this analysis and interpretation. Sometimes I have doubts about the credibility of what we say, of what we write. I recognize it's fascinating. I've used myself some of these concepts like inscription, delegation. But on the other hand, I have always this kind of perplexity. It's very nice to be trapped into this kind of web that you basically weaves around you and around objects and things. But on the other hand, it's a bit unsatisfactory.
Because of the metaphorical language?
It's a metaphor. I mean, it's a metaphorical. It's a whole metaphorical structure that is employed there. It's a trickery that is employed. And I mean, I might talk about the same. I might describe a process of change. For example, take the notion of translation. With this model of translation, with participation, and then I don't know, enrollment and mobilization. I mean, it's always the same. No matter whether he talks about apricots or geometrical diagrams or bacteria or volcanoes, it's always like that. I mean, that makes me perplexed. That makes me doubtful. What is a translation? I mean, I can understand what a translation is, but on the other hand, I see a bit of kind of superficiality in using this notion of everything.
Well, is it any more superficial than Heidegger saying that everything boils down to the question of being? This is what philosophers do. Philosophers tend to oversimplify things. This is our profession.
That's how you recognize him as philosopher.
In a way, yes. The fact that there's a certain monotony to every great philosopher. Heidegger, you've got all these 28,000 pages and counting, and most of them are completely repetitive, and you can get by with reading 40 or 50 of them probably. As far as the metaphorical use of the language, it doesn't bother me for some reason. I don't know of any other way to write well than to do that. How could he?
You write very well, actually. Yeah.
But using metaphors.
Yeah, using metaphors. But I mean, metaphors are a way of seeing and a way of not seeing. I mean, sometimes when I read Latour, I always think about what you cannot grasp by using this theory. I wouldn't call it theory because it's not a theory. I mean, it's I don't know what it is. I can't say.
So what is not grasped? Just take one example.
For example, I had some kind of empirical problems in the description of change processes in complex institutional settings, in which if I had to go the way it goes, I would miss a lot of phenomena. I mean, now I can't explain too much.
What sorts of phenomena is what I have in mind? I mean, how are they outside of the actor network paradigm?
I think that the notion of translation is much more painful, laborious, and problematic than the way he uses, the way he enacts it. All these connections, we jump there. It doesn't really work. I mean, it's much more painful, and there are counterintuitive, there are perverse effects, and things don't work, and the way. But I'm not saying that cannot be used. I mean that it has to be a theory.
Well,
you must give me ways of being out and being in. If you don't give me that kind of freedom, then your credibility goes down as a theorist.
You must be dealing with some pretty amazing institutional problems, because I just reread the Pasteur book, and I was surprised by how excruciating and laborious it was for Pasteur to spread his ideas. The long, I don't know if it's fresh in your mind, but all the stories Latour tells about the hygienists were allies and the doctors were opponents, it takes decades for this to play out. And it was almost painful to read again. So yeah, you must be dealing with something even worse than the Pasteurian.
Look, I haven't read the Constitution in France. I've read other things.
I think at one level we're kind of perhaps being a bit harsh on Latour in kind of saying either you've got to have a theory that does everything, and because at one level you could say that the relationships and the translations he expects to be horribly complicated. He says we're going to get a very, very boring, low level, every single step. Now that might not be what you present in a 5,000-word article,
right.
But at one level the methodology or the approach or whatever, subject to the how do things change if it's only in a relation, which is a whole separate problem,
right.
is there within what he's claiming to try to do. Now, certainly there is a problem that people say, oh, we look for translations and we find the obligatory passage point and we can easily identify it, and everybody cringes when they see that kind of version of ANT applied. But that's not necessarily the same as saying the overarching approach that he's trying to present can't be at least played with and explored and raises the kinds of questions that you've raised about if it's all in the relations, how do the relations change? Because that has to be something that causes the relations to change.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's almost 1:30, I know.
Yes, I know. Did you want to respond?
Well, yes, and I hope I wasn't sounding harsh on him at all. I think
that it was everybody else that was being
harsh.
Oh,
okay. Yeah, I find the Pasteur case study masterful, and I find his other case studies generally masterful, and I know how hard he works on these. There's always more work than shows up in the... He's picking the best of the best, usually, when he gives his case studies.
Yeah. I'm really sorry because we are coming up to the sort of our cut-off time. I've got Lucas and Crisanti, so let's see how we can squeeze that all that in, and then you're the third one. Okay. and that will probably have to be the last question.
Just two things. Comments maybe based on the questions asked. I think the reason why consciousness is always brought up, and the reason why agency inevitably in most people's minds, agency inevitably has to be human agency, or all agency is originally human in some way, is linked to the problem of social organization, in as much as we want something to be responsible. So it's a question of responsibility in the way we organize society, the way we want to allocate blame or allocate success or allocate whatever, that we require human intentionality as a way of explaining or accounting for things. And I think that's and because philosophy was often written from a point of epistemology, it was always the questions we ask about the world. So since we're asking the questions about the world, it's our consciousness that's implicated, etc., etc. So I think it's a human. It's because this is a human project, and we start with ourselves, and in that sense, and we want to account for the world in our terms, and therefore, human agency, human intentionality figures very largely. And I think it's a really difficult step to move away from that.
Yes.
It's a really difficult step, which comes back to this question of, which is the second comment I want to raise, and this is about whether translation is metaphorical. The question of translation, I think it's not. I think it means it literally. And I think it means it in the sense that when you put the cup down on the table, there is a translation in as much as the cup is encountered by the table, or the way in which those two actors encounter each other is in terms of that which is relevant in that encounter, which is the table translates the cup as a weight or whatever, and which is different to when I'm looking at the cup. I look at the cup, I translate it as something to drink with, or whatever. So the encounter between me and the cup is no different to the encounter between the cup and the table.
Right.
In terms of translation.
Right.
So it's literal. It's not metaphorical.
It has to be said that Latour doesn't do as much with that as he could have. I think since he's focused on the philosophy of science, there is a human observer there. I can't think of any cases where Latour actually analyzes simply the relation between two things with no human presence.
Yes, that's true.
Whereas Whitehead does it. Whitehead is his great philosophical inspiration. Does do this, at least in principle, more than Latour does. But I think Latour leaves the door open for that when he says that two things translate each other just as we translate them. Yeah. And so I think it's wrong to say, as some people do, that he's reducing everything to a human perception, which is what Delanda is going to say in his next book, I believe, when he criticizes Latour. Manuel Delanda, the great Deleuzian in New York. Who's next?
Crisanti.
I didn't know that Latour is about Kafka dimensions. How important is this in the way he develops his ideas, and how, again, that compares with
I've got a couple of things to say about that. People have talked about this. He's certainly more a Catholic philosopher than a Protestant philosopher. There are all these mediators which the Protestants were trying to get rid of. Get rid of all the saints, get rid of all the rituals, have a direct relationship with God, read the Bible yourself. And so many people have talked, at least in private, I don't know if this has been published yet, but many people have said Latour is a very Catholic philosopher. It's going through all these intermediaries to reach...
So not only the religiosity of him, but the specific...
Yes. That's right.
Theology.
As far as the religiosity, he does have the one book, Jubilee. One of Latour's remarkable theological ideas is that God is not a substance. God exists in the circulation of references of the entire religious network, which...
So it's a network too?
Yes, yeah. Which I find that hard to square with traditional religiosity.
Is he moving towards plasma now?
Could God be the plasma? It just erupts and startles the religious network with a new
But
problem.
seriously, my question is it really in this kind of philosophy? Because that's so much outside our discourse. And we are trying to relate to these theories in a purely rational way, even though we go beyond the rationalistic kind of, we manage that.
Yeah.
But say in our field, the other aspect that might be important in philosophers is totally absent somehow, or suppressed, or whatever. How important do you think it is for grasping what is there?
I would say important. He doesn't seem to leave enough room for it.
He hides it.
To some extent, or he doesn't, at least doesn't sufficiently account for it. I'm glad that he's...
Heidegger?
Oh, Heidegger. Well, Heidegger, you can always make the mistake of identifying God with being, I think. I don't really see much room for God in Heidegger's philosophy either. That's a fashion now, Heidegger and the religion, the holy. Heidegger and the holy. There are a lot of books about this now. Yeah, maybe, but where is God in that? Because God would be a specific being, which for Heidegger is always a bad thing. God is not being itself for Heidegger. So I think there's just sort of a vague religiosity there. And Heidegger himself seemed to have retained some sort of respect for religion at the end of his day. He'd go in and pray in churches sometimes at the end of his life, despite having withdrawn from the religion completely. But I don't see within his philosophy how you work this out. People are trying to explain the fourfold in terms of religion now, which I think is an absolute mistake. There's no way to do it. So I'm upset about that. When people try to drag the fourfold into Heidegger's philosophy of religion, where it has no place. And
sorry, and that has to be the absolute last question. I'm really sorry, Mark.
How do you understand the idea? I'm glad you brought it up just now, circulating object. How do you understand the concept of circulating reference to an object? Is that not potentiality of becoming, of the unfolding?
It's a kind of translation across time. He calls it a trajectory. And yes, and the object is different in each stage. That's the key for him. It's not the same thing anymore. It's a third actor who has to say that it's the same thing. And in many cases, it's not controversial at all. It's not controversial to say this is the same chair as it was yesterday because the changes are very slight. But it's controversial if you want to talk about which country is the rightful heir of some defunct country that's broken up into pieces or something like that. It becomes very controversial. Or who's doing the real phenomenology now in philosophy? Is it the rigorous Husserlians, or is it me, or is it Heidegger's followers, or Latour? Then it becomes controversial to know where the trajectory went. And so there really are transformations at each stage. So it's not potential, because potential would imply that already contained in German Edmund Husserl was Heidegger's philosophy, which Latour would not be able to say. Latour would have to say that Heidegger translated it into a new form, and that somebody else translates Heidegger.
Sorry, real quick.
Sure.
It's about the relation, right?
Yes.
So does it matter, as a unit of analysis or as the actual ontology of A&T, does it matter? There's more than one set of relations happening at the same time. I mean, in that way, the potentiality come through the different interactions. So there's always, there's more than one set of relations happening to every object on this earth.
Right.
At one moment in time.
Right. But that can't really be the seed of my next state of affairs, can it? Because if I'm totally defined by my relations to all of you and everything else, then that's totally definite, and I don't see how anything new could ever emerge from that. You think that the two different relations I have are interacting somehow? Actually, I think that's pretty close to the way we have to go for a solution. That there has to be a way where two things that I'm in relation to come into relation through me, and that's what changes. But I think that has to happen in a very special place. That can't happen at a relational level. I think it has to happen on the inside of an object, and I'll leave that as the teaser for my next book, because that's what it's about. Yes.
Well, I think I've had the potential to be a good chairperson, and I've completely failed. I've So we are 10 minutes past when we wanted to finish. But I wanted to thank Graham very much for coming and spending time with us. Thank you.